Hello all, welcome back. Today I have quite a beefy video to share with you guys. This is a D&D commission that I completed for one of my patrons. It's the full group, which I've not done. Doing groups is something that I don't have a lot of practice with, so this was definitely something new for me to chew on, and it shows, which is why this video is so long. You can definitely see the frustration, or at least I can, and I'll point it out. This whole project was a test of procrastination that you'll be able to see. So as you can see, we started out with the basic sketch. Well, that's not really basic. I started out on paper, and I really wanted to draw from the campaign as much as possible, really give the group and my commissioner, the client, like a real feel for like, oh, that's my story. So we worked together a little bit, and she gave me some background on what happened during their campaign and who all the different characters are, and I pulled from that this scene with I guess there was a lich, and it was in the middle of the jungle, and they had to find keys for the store. So I really kind of zeroed in on that because I felt like this door would be a good backdrop and a good centerpiece for the scene. And that part was really easy for me. And I don't know why, but I had a really strong image of what I wanted that to look like, so I went straight to paper and sketched that out really quick. Tightened it all up, and initially my plan for the characters was to draw everyone individually on paper, scan everyone in individually, render them all individually, and kind of place them into the scene and edit them to look correct in the environment. That didn't really work. It super did not work out that way. And I have a couple of paper sketches of the first character that I worked on, which was the giant, the stone giant. And you know, I scanned what I had in, and it wasn't working, and I got frustrated, and so I just said, screw it, I'll do the whole thing digitally. Which is already by itself something that I'm not super accustomed to doing. The way I normally work is I work on paper first, scan it in, digitally render from there. So this was kind of a new approach, but it just felt right. So I started with the stone giant, and you can see that here, and I got really locked into it. And part of that was me procrastinating and me being anxious about working on everything else. And yeah, I was frustrated. So I ended up working on the stone giant for quite a bit, and I came back to him multiple times throughout this piece, just kind of poking and prodding. Yeah. He came out looking okay. I like the way he came out, and I think that was part of it. Is that I liked how I rendered it, and I wasn't sure how I was going to render everyone else the same way. I did move on. And you can see here I'm working on the halfling that's in the background, and he was a fresh hell. Getting everyone to be the right proportion for their different races was very tricky to fit them into the space and have them look correct for their height categories. So we have 2 halflings, we have a stone giant, an Azamar, 2 high elves, if I remember right, and then a drow. And getting everyone to look correct was a little tricky, and the guy in the background was exceptionally tricky because he was so far in the back, and he's a halfling, so he was gonna be pretty small. And then, you know, getting the details how I wanted them, and I wasn't quite where I wanted to be, like hadn't figured out how I wanted to render everyone yet, and so I spent a lot of time on him just kind of fussing around with things. And you can see whenever I get really frustrated in this piece, I will start playing with textures. That's what I do. Or I'll get frustrated and I'll start painting the background. And that was just like, I need a break. I need to do something that I know how to do. So you'll see me periodically throughout this, like, just drop the character that I'm working on and start painting leaves, or you'll see everything flash wildly with different watercolor or paper textures just because I'm just taking a break. It all does come together, I promise. So here I'm working on one of the high elves. At this point, I'm pretty solid with getting line work down. I had settled on using a brush called Stumpy Pencil, which I picked up many years ago, and I'll see if I can't find a link to where you can get that. I don't know if the blog is still around, but I'll see if I can find it, and if I do, I'll put a link to it. But it's a really nice, versatile pencil brush. I think it has a really nice line quality to it, and it I don't know, has kind of a nice illustrative feel. It blended well with the other painted brushes that I was using, and it was solid enough to where I wasn't like constantly going over again. Yeah, so here I'm angrily rendering the background. And you can kind of see flashes of my reference material. My client had a few other group commissions done in the past. So I did have some reference material for what these characters should look like, which was a huge help. If you ever if you ever commission work from an artist and have other artwork that you've commissioned of whatever you're requesting, please send that along. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but it does help quite a bit. And this character, this is the drow. She was the one who came out the best, I'd say. Like, she just had the best characterization, and the way she finished up was just really nice. I really liked how she ended up. Her pose was extremely tricky for me, though, and I did end up sourcing some reference material for it. And it's kind of funny, and especially looking back at it now, because there's like a certain, you know, when you're zoomed way out, it's easy to be like, oh yeah, that's the pose I want, it looks great. And then you zoom in and you're like trying to finish up the line work, and it's like, wait a minute, none of this makes sense, and that's not how bodies work. And that's definitely where, like, go get reference. It's okay. I don't know why people argue against it. It's so much better when you look up reference material. And there we go, frustrated again. Some of it's also just me like procrastinating, like, yeah, going back to this halfling character. I was just angsting about getting him to look right and getting his details to read from a distance. I didn't want to. So texture time. You'll see over the course of a few videos, if you stick around, there's one particular texture, which you can see here, that I like to use in most of my work anymore. It's a scan of some chipboard, just like a thick stock, really thin cardboard or cardstock. I find that it's got a really great paper texture. It does really well warming up a piece without being really obtrusive. And I find I'm able to make my digital work look close to physical media by using this paper texture. I think it's nice. And I usually put that on a layer above everything and set it to a soft light layer style. And then sometimes I'll set the opacity to quite a bit lower, just so it's not very obtrusive. Back to painting the giant again. I was really happy with how his hands and how his feet came out. I think those are like the two of my favorite things on this whole piece. It's one of those things where you just suddenly have this epiphany moment, like, oh, I know how hands work. And then it suddenly just like comes together. And this character here, this halfling in the foreground, she was kind of the turning point for the character painting style. After working on the giant for so long, and tooling around with some of the line art and some of the other characters, and messing with the halfling in the background, and not really settling on any one thing, working on her, I really settled on what style I wanted to go for, because I had to admit to myself that I'm obviously frustrated with this. This is definitely going to be a piece that I'm going to be working on for quite a while, but I want to try and expedite things as much as possible so that I can get it to my clients as soon as possible. So I ended up doing kind of a soft cell shaded look, or at least starting with flats that were cell shaded and working into a more blended type of look from there, almost like markers. And I discovered that was pretty easy to do. It went pretty quickly, and it was easy to replicate across all of the characters. So once I got that down, it's like, oh cool, I can do this for everyone. The trickiest thing was definitely the line art, though. Like, that was the sticking point. Getting the figures right was hell, especially for this character. I worked on this elf for a solid like 2 days before his pose looked right, and you can see like I'm way zoomed out just trying to get the proportions to look anywhere close to correct. And you zoom in and like you can see that those lines are so chunky. So I had to, once I got the pose to look semi-natural from a distance, I had to zoom back in and try and pick out the form from those chunky shapes. And it was tricky. Like, not even gonna beat around the bush there. It took a long time. And it's like I was telling one of my friends, there's a fine line when a character is sitting on a ledge like this, there's a fine line between comfortably sitting with legs apart and being kind of thirsty about it. There's a fine line there. But I got it. I got it and I was able to move on, and it was such a relief. One of the other things that was tricky about this character, there was a few things actually. First thing was that from the character description, he wears all black or mostly dark colors. And for a character in the foreground, fortunately, I put him in the foreground. So I was able to add more detail. I was able to add more detail. I could show more of the line work coming through. And I could have a little bit more variation between shades of darker colors. So he's not wearing all flat black. And this was the other tricky thing. So I learned a trick. You can see I'm struggling with the line work here because straight lines. But if you create a solid shape and then you go and double click that layer and go and give it a stroke, and then you can, if you make your stroke a different color from the fill color, you can then rasterize the layer and delete the fill color, and you're left with a stroke of the thing, a transparent shape. So that's what I did with the bow, because I was getting extremely frustrated trying to get straight lines and those bevels, and I was, screw it. This was the last character that I ended up finishing up, mostly just because he had one of the more complicated poses. Pretty much any of the characters that were holding props were tricky. And he's holding a harp, which not only is it tricky to begin with, but it's a transparent shape and he's interacting with it. And so that was just like, it was a sticking point for me, and I didn't want to do it for a long time. But it came out really, really well. Surprisingly so. And this guy was also tricky, and I was anxious about it because I've actually drawn this character before in a prior commission. And I'm not the best at consistency. I'm pretty bad at consistency, actually. And so knowing that I had drawn this character before gave me this sense of like, oh, well, heck, I gotta get it to look like the same character. And so you can't see it, but I've got the prior drawing that I did up in another window just so I could see it. And I think I did all right. I would say I feel like it's recognizably the same character. The tricky thing about him though is that he's an Asmar, so he's blue, and he's the only blue one in this lineup. So getting his skin tone to look natural and not like a nuclear colored Smurf was difficult. Alright, back to the elf in the foreground. So you can see I'm working with different subtle shades of darker colors to bring his outfit together. And I kind of stuck with no two shades touching each other. You know, not having the same shade against the same shade per article of clothing. And that kind of helped differentiate the different layers of his armor. And once I got a couple of the characters mostly all rendered, I could start going back through and kind of doing broad sweeps over everyone, bringing up similar details, different highlights. And here I am going back to this halfling in the background. Actually, man, I was so frustrated through something, and I don't even remember what happened or what I was playing with, but I deleted the entire layer that I was working on for him. So I had to start entirely over with his painting, which, now that I'm past it, was probably the best thing to have happened. Because I hadn't really settled on a painting style when I initially started painting that character. He didn't quite look the same as the rest of them. He didn't really fit in, and he didn't have very good contrast against the background. So accidentally deleting all of that painted layer allowed me to go back with fresh eyes and redo it, and do it better. And I think it worked out. And here I am working on the drow. She had the most detailed armor out of everyone, which was tricky because she's sitting in kind of a tricky pose. And I've always had difficulty imagining what armor does when you sit. I should have looked up more reference for it, but I ended up not going that direction at the end. I ended up sticking with just a breastplate and some pauldrons for her, which I tailored down. You can see I used the transform tool to squish and pinch it down a little bit because she was looking a little thick for her frame. Here I'm going to use the same trick that I used for the bow. And I was just trying to get a smoother edge, which for this particular sword wasn't super necessary. It's a black sword, so the harsher outline, it's not going to show up regardless. And I felt really proud of how the sword came out, because I totally freehanded that hilt. Didn't even think about it, I just, oh, there it is. So one of the brushes that I use for the painting portion is a Coyote Webster brush. It's the Gouache Wet Alternate brush. And I tend to use it at a slightly lesser opacity, like between 75 and 80. I feel like it gives off a nice matte painted look, and it really meshes really well with that paper texture that I use. So you can see in a little bit, I flatten the whole thing and then paint on a layer above the entire flattened piece. And I feel like this gouache brush works really well with it works really well with textures and kind of blending over painting with it. Well, you'll see. We'll get there. All right, last dude. The colors of his outfit I kind of waffled on him a little bit. The initial commission piece that I did of this character, he was wearing all white. He's a bard. He's kind of a fancy dude. And so for this one, in the character description, it was more like, okay, well, when he's out adventuring, he wears leather armor. I was like, well, he wears all white when he's being fancy, but and so that was really tricky, but I settled on it. And then, so after I settled on his colors and I got them all worked up, I tried to keep it like a classy color scheme. After that, it was time for me to start moving on to finishing up the background. And here you can see I've cheated. So if you've been on Patreon for a little bit, or if you've been to my Gumroad, you can see that I've got some painted plant assets that you can download. I didn't want to paint more plants like I did on the left, but I wanted something back there, so I grabbed one of these plants that I had painted previously and I stuck it there in the back. And I'm happy with it. I regret nothing. So then I started painting some of the environment details, and I go back and forth, turning the texture on and off, just making sure that everything looks good at the saturation that it's going to be. But I can't have that texture layer on while I'm painting because since it's set to a soft light layer style and it's laying on top of my painted layer, the color picking isn't accurate. So here you can see I flattened the whole thing. I was getting frustrated, and there's just like a certain point where it feels like, okay, it's time. I need to put on my big kid pants and I need to just do it. And one of the things I always have to remind myself is, okay, well, I might paint over some edges, but you know what? I painted them once, I can paint them again. And so that's kind of what you see me doing here. I'm painting details that are technically behind the characters, but I'm painting them on top of the characters on a separate layer. And though it might be hard to see, I am going in and strengthening those outlines on the characters where I need to. And I feel like it's okay, you know? I feel like it helps integrate the characters into their environment by having edges that are a little bit softer or overpainted or incorporated into the different aspects of the environment. I feel like it helps. Even though sometimes or at least in the moment, it feels kind of accidental or unintentional. You can see I stole the plants from the left side and mirrored them on the right and then overpainted them because it was cheating time. When it came to the background, I had some outside help. I follow another artist on Twitter and on Patreon. His name is Jonah Lobe, and I'll post links to where you can find him below. He's a great guy. He's one of the artists who worked on Fallout and on Skyrim, and part of his Patreon is that he does critiques. So like once a month, I guess. If you're of a certain patronage, you can post a link to your work and ask for advice. And I asked him for advice on how to do dappled lighting. Because I really wanted it to kind of look like they were shaded by trees, even though you can't really see it. And he gave me some really good advice, and so I really tried to employ that. And that's it. It's all finished. This whole thing was crazy frustrating, but you know what? I finished it. So yeah, if you have questions, if you have comments, if you want to know how I did a thing, or if you have suggestions for the future, please feel free to comment below and let me know. And I'll see you next time.